The genesis of what I'm going to talk about is an issue that I've seen and really been working on for the last few years, maybe the last 2 years, is really kind of getting out of this mindset of kind of complex exercises, purple teaming, red team engagements, while very beneficial, oftentimes get a little spendy, so to speak, and also have a tendency to really only happen once a year. And with a constant shifting of ransomware, specifically TTPs, threat actors, it's really important for us to have a construct and some tools to really kind of get some reps in both the detection and response aspects of responding to ransomware. This has already been covered just real quick. I've been in the industry about a decade, as was already said. Author, really focused on kind of the blue side of everything, and located in Rapid City, South Dakota. So if you're familiar with Mount Rushmore, that's just down the road from it. What we're going to talk really about today is the what and why, really, of emulation, and actually give some context to where this fits into overall readiness. We're going to look at the atomic red team testing and validation tools. Full disclosure, I'm a principal security solutions specialist with Red Canary, so I'm kind of partial to this tool. The beautiful thing about this tool is, though, although Red Canary owns it, it's a community-based tool. So we have a lot of contributors outside of Red Canary that have really made this tool very powerful for us in terms of its ability to mimic and emulate those ransomware TTPs that we're so concerned about. We'll look at some emulation types, breaking these out into four real broad categories that are going to help us understand where this fits in and really how to actually run these. We're going to actually walk through building an emulation and then do some quick video demos of not so much, hey, this is how it works. Obviously, that's what we want to cover. But one of the other key advantages to doing this is time, is this takes very little time, very little effort. So as a result, we can actually do this much more and work through some of these emulations without the need to pull in external teams or potentially cut a check for some sort of ransomware emulation or pen test in that regard. So what is it? What are we actually doing here? Well, really what we do is we take our threat actor TTPs, those things that they do, tactics, techniques, procedures, and we are there to gain insight. So one of the key things that we look at here, this aspect of ransomware emulation, is cyber threat intelligence and researching and having some sort of resource, multiple resources, where you can actually work through and extract these TTPs. So not only are we emulating what they're doing, we're also actually gaining insight into threat actor behaviors. We're kind of killing two birds with one stone. We take those TTPs and we run simulated attacks, either one at a time or a succession. So what do I mean by that is oftentimes we want to focus on a single technique that they're running, whether it's credential access, maybe it's using PowerShell as a download cradle for that secondary payload, or we're going to string these together into a sequence of attacks that give us some sense of how this threat actor is operating. Really what this does for us is it validates our detective controls and our response actions. Detective controls, even preventive controls, are not 100%. Even if we do get a detection, maybe we get a detection on a post-exploitation tool like Mimikatz. What do we do with that? And this is one of the keys to take this emulation, going from detection validation all the way into, hey, how do we respond? And we'll be looking at that as well. So why are we emulating? Well, we're looking at both attack and detection. So if you think about if you've ever played sports, football, soccer, baseball, basketball, you don't just practice on your side. there's oftentimes a lot of time spent looking at what, hey, the next game on Saturday is going to look like. We're going to go up against the Huskies. What do they do? What are their TTPs that they use to win? So this forces us to really look at both the attack side and our own detection and response side. So it really forces us into that outside of this very myopic view, soda straw view of our own, and into a larger context of where these threats sit in. Validating detection rules is really critical. This is a really solid way to say, hey, this will work or this won't. And sometimes things we are going to test are not going to kick off a detection. We can't kick off a detection every time somebody runs PowerShell. Your system admins are going to go insane. But are there things that we can do to see what we can actually detect on? Here's another thing that stretching this emulation is, it'll give your IR team, whether you've got a part-time team or a full-time team, some realistic data to analyze. Been in this industry for a very long time. It's very tough to get new data without sitting down and actually running through a full sequence of attack. But if I just have a single endpoint that I can run Atomic Red Team on, and I focus on a single technique, very easy, very realistic, and I still get that motor muscle memory. And the last bullet, practice. We're getting that motor muscle memory into our, not just our detection, but how do we pivot from a detection into a response? Here's the other thing, flexibility. As I was talking about, this is something that you can run a single test or more in-depth emulations. So if you think about where we are right now, we've taken this concept. We're going to go to cyber threat intelligence. We're building out basically the TTPs that we see. And then we build in an emulation plan, a plan that uses something like Atomic Red Team. And in this particular case, that's what we're going to look at, Atomic Red Team, to actually do that. So let's talk about Atomic Red Team. As I said, it is a library of tests that a Red Canary maintains, but it is a community-based tool, meaning we have contributors from all over, from all different teams. And as a result, you're getting a wide range of expertise being built into it. And essentially, it is a list down to the technique, down to the sub-technique of various TTPs mapped to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. This makes it very easy to go from a threat intelligence report into the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and then pivot directly into a test that matches or it comes at least close to mimicking real ransomware attacks. This is going to simulate adversarial activity. And I say simulate and not a 100% real. There's still some variance. It's understood that this is a variance. We're getting as close to the real thing as possible without encrypting our network. But from a cost perspective and a level of effort perspective, it's a very good solution to addressing that. This can be run manually. We're going to show some manual processes, or in frameworks such as Caldera, which have Atomic Red Team tests built in. So if you think we're taking our threat intelligence and we're now marrying it up to individual techniques, we're going to be able to pivot from there and address that detection and response piece. So Atomic Red Team is essentially that library of tools. So as we said, we have a library of tests for validating visibility and detective controls. It's really good for that. We can also extend it out into leaving actual trace evidence on a system that our incident response analysts can go in and actually see if they can discover, if they can actually identify. So we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like when we get into some of the atomic drills. One of the others is a tool oftentimes is necessary with Atomic Red Team. Atomic Red Team can be standalone. You can run specific tests, but if we're going to get into emulation and we're going to be using emulation plans, you're going to need something like either Invoke Atomic. So this is a PowerShell-based execution framework. It runs basically on an endpoint, any type of Windows endpoint that has PowerShell. And this is used to set up, configure, and run tests. You can run tests singularly with Invoke Atomic, or you can, in this case, we'll look at is an emulation plan, is an actual PowerShell script where we put all of the TTPs together, run them, and then actually pivot off and conduct whatever we want to do from there. Another option is the Atomic Test Harness. It is, again, another PowerShell-based tool. So this is fairly easy to configure. If you have half hour and some basic knowledge of PowerShell, it's very easy to come up with emulation plans. And all an emulation plan is a number of these tests together in sequence. So we'll actually look at that as a quick demo, but just to kind of level set where an emulation plan is really a simple PowerShell script where we put all of these clusters of TTPs together, execute, and then carry on kind of whatever our objective is at that point. And in this case, we'll look at what are some emulation types. So at the far left is a single technique. We're focused on something that we see constantly in the environment, right? One of the key ones right here is operating system credential dumps. Whether that's Mimikatz, whether that is a tool such as ProcDump, any number of these things, but we're focused on a single technique. Threat, we're looking at more of a threat, whether that threat is a tool or a specific sequence of TTPs that are often associated with a threat. Raspberry Robin, for example. Stage, this is where we focus on a specific ransomware phase. Think about it as either a phase or any type of kill chain that you're using in your own detection controls, your response actions, how you view the threat actor's movement through the environment. And then finally, a threat actor. And we'll go into a little bit more of the detail of these and kind of what this actually looks like, because this is really important, because what you can do, again, is tailor this to what you are really focused on. And we'll go into that real quick here. So the first one is that technique. Very straightforward. This is where we're going to go out to atomicredteam.io. All the resources that I reference will be included in the slides. But what we do is we look for a single technique. We go ahead and actually pull that technique, execute it, and then determine what it's actually doing. So where do we get these? You can go ahead and grab whatever your kind of flavor of threat intelligence really is. Obviously, Red Canary publishes the threat detection report. We have a breakdown of the top techniques that we see, the top 10 techniques, but you may be partial to M-trends. Here's the other thing, is this is very easy to do out of band. If you see something that's novel or you haven't seen in a while, comes across in some sort of email blast or out there in the ether, this is a good way to check to see if, hey, are we going to be able to see this? So look for those either high volume, meaning, hey, we see this in 80% of ransomware cases, 90% of ransomware cases. That's what you might want to focus on that initial. This is a really good starting point with Atomic Red Team. If you're not familiar with it, you've never used Atomic Red Team, it's as a caveat, it's very well documented, but you may just want to run a single test. We run that test and we get a few reps in there. Single technique's really good for detection validation. All right, can we see this? If we ran this in the environment, could we see this? The other thing is you may see something like PowerShell download cradle is a good one. Can we find evidence from artifacts? When we're talking response, we may have an alert, right? Hey, we have a connection out to a known bad command and control site, or a secondary payload delivery site, or even GitHub, right? Well, what would we see with that whole sequence of events? So if I ran an atomic test and it basically fired off and reached out to GitHub, think about in your own mind, hey, what would I actually see from an evidence standpoint if I went out and grabbed say, a triage package from that endpoint, what would I see? If I was to look at firewall proxy logs, what would I actually see? So this is, again, stretching that out a little bit, is look for what artifacts you could extract and then analyze and find those indicators from those artifacts. Techniques are also really good for detection and response drills. Right now, we'll just say a detection and response drill is a very, very short exercise that you do with your cybersecurity teams or your security operations teams. We'll go into a little bit of that in terms of detail. But this is something, if you had 10, 15 minutes and you wanted to, hey, talk to your security operations and say, I want to see if you know where to find evidence of that download cradle. Here we go. I'm going to fire one off. Go. You've got 10 minutes to come back to me and tell me exactly what I downloaded. This is where that can actually come in and be handy for the overall team. We get into threat now. So if you figure we're going from maybe a single technique, maybe a handful of techniques, and we're starting to move up in terms of a threat. So we examine that threat. We look at Raspberry Robin, and we want to extract those TTPs from Raspberry Robin. This is where we're going to start putting this in a PowerShell script. And again, this is a very simple script. All you really have to do is use something like invoke atomic, and you'll see a demonstration of this, and list the commands in. We start executing this via PowerShell and that emulation script. And what it's really here to do, again, detection validation, think about that's your low-hanging fruit. That's a little checkbox that you want to check off to make sure, hey, we can actually see this. We can detect this type of behavior. Here's the other thing. Again, going back to identify potential evidence sources. So if you think of a threat out there, think Raspberry Robin, or even something we may be more familiar with, like Cobalt Strike. What does it do? What are some of the things that post-exploitation framework will do? Do we have a specific signature that we can see? If we can emulate it, we can identify those potential sources for that specific technique. Again, we're hitting on the detection and response drill. And one of the key takeaways is this is a fairly straightforward, very easy model to actually build in those into your overall security operations training. So again, we're now looking at a threat, maybe taking half a dozen to a dozen different techniques. Now we're moving right to left. We went from just that single technique to maybe a handful, and now we're looking at a stage or a phase or a part of a kill chain. So in this case, post-exploitation. Let's kind of walk through a prototypical ransomware. Somebody gets into the system, they have multi-stages, they've got their foothold, and now they're going to start their reconnaissance. They're going to look at maybe dumping credentials, maybe using something like Sharphound, or just the native Windows command line. Who am I? Right? That very, that catch-all, like, hey, where am I in the world here? So in this stage, what we do is we gather up maybe 10, 15 different highly common post-exploitation TTPs. So that who am I, for example, is a really good one. All right. And then we can also break that down into, hey, defense evasion. Are there specific tests that we can look for defense evasion? Again, we're doing this from threat intelligence. This is kind of the underpinning to emulation. Good emulation is going to match as best as you can what's actually happening out there in the real world. It doesn't make any sense to actually pull something completely off the wall and try to emulate it. That's fine if you've already gone through all of this. But for right now, we're focused on tying this directly to what's happening. What the stage really does is it's now giving us a broader picture of activity that we would normally or potentially normally see in an environment that's under attack with a ransomware. So it's giving us that behavioral look. This is what we're going to see. We're going to see potentially who am I, and then some additional commands mapping out Active Directory environments, potentially looking at where we are on the network, what network connections, what DNS servers we're using, all of that stuff. Then we can move into, hey, we might not be able to get the initial execution or the secondary payload, but if we're looking at validating our detection around some of these post-exploitation pieces, it's really going to help us. One of the other things that I like to do with this stage is actually put this as part of a tabletop exercise. So think about your standard tabletop exercise with a PowerPoint template, and you're sitting there for 2.5 hours and you're doing your injects. This is a good way to add some spice to that and actually say, hey, I'm going to give the security operations team a little, hey, post-exploitation activity that they got to go hunt down while everybody else is discussing. And they can sit there with their laptop and RDS into our testing machine and see what's going on. So it's a good way to actually integrate some spice, so a little bit more technical acumen into your tabletop exercises as well. So think about running kind of the operational things over on one pillar, and then over here you're working with your security operations saying, hey, this is what's going on. And then 10 minutes later, run another. And then, hey, we're seeing continual activity. So it's a good way to actually put some spice into tabletops. Building in complexity is that threat actor. This is a complete picture of what a threat actor is doing. In this case, we're going to actually look at the threat actor Akira right now. And again, very similar to that threat piece, but in reality, what we're doing is we're just trying to make sure that we understand, hey, what's going on from detective controls. Are we set, right? You've got that request coming from the CISO or the CIO, potentially the CEO. Hey, I read about the secure ransomware. Are we set? Can we detect it? You may not say, hey, we are not going to detect everything, but we're definitely understand their TTPs, and we've aligned, detective controls against that threat actor. Gives us that more and more data for incident responders to investigate. This is a really good piece if we're looking at this, is we want to, again, build that into our overall approach, is having them understand at a high level, and they have the cheat sheet, if you really want to do it that way, is to say, here's the ransomware emulation plan. Here's the system. We're going to fire it off. You tell us what happened. Or the best part is, hey, we're going to do something to this endpoint. You tell us what happened. So really helps them understand and be prepared to investigate, say, something like Akira, and identify those TTPs they come across if they run the prefetch files, or if they run Windows sysmon logs and they see all of this activity. And again, this just adds a lot more in terms of a realistic scenario for exercises. We can actually fire off this and work with all of this data to really kind of give us a sense of what's happening. So think about all of the things that happen when you kick off any type of testing. What are some of those evidence sources that you're going to see? A lot of this is just straight up Windows executables. So you may be able to just parse out a lot of those. But again, we're making this a little bit more realistic. So if we go from a tabletop into more of a technical, going, hey, I executed a ransomware, Akira ransomware threat emulation plan. See what you can find. See if we can match these up one for one. So let's kind of look at the complexity, but very simple. That initial access, maybe technique. We're doing multiple techniques under a threat. We're taking that adversary. We're taking a lot of those techniques that we would see an adversary execute on a system, and then look at, hey, how do those actually work in conjunction with each other? And then finally, that adversary complete. We're taking kind of the whole panoply of TTPs that a ransomware actor is doing, and we're putting them together. So we've talked a lot about, hey, this is what we can do with the scripts. Let's talk about how to build one real quick. It's not a difficult process unless you really can go blind doing cut and paste, because there's a lot of cut and paste. So first thing is, grab yourself some threat intelligence. If you have your trusted sources, this is agnostic to that. We don't necessarily need a whole bunch of different sources. If you have something that you really trust, a handful of those, that's perfect. In this case, we're going to use a CISA advisory, specifically around Akira. What we do is we go through and we look for the tactics and techniques. The reason I like CISA, because I'm efficient, it's not lazy, I'm efficient, is they just literally list all of the TTPs by MITRE ATT&CK as part of the report. I don't have to do much heavy lifting going through the report. They're very technical. They're very much aligned to what's actually going on. Other sources like MTrends, the threat detection report, also are mapped to the MITRE ATT&CK tactics and techniques. This is really, really useful. If you're going to go down this road and you're starting to think about doing some of this, atomicredteam.io, and then of course the Red Canary Atomic Red Team GitHub are really good, but Atomic Red Team IO is really good for finding those matching techniques. Lots of descriptions, lots of data on what to select. And then all we're going to do is build a very simple PowerShell script that we can run. So what does this look like from a process, right? So we've got that Akira ransomware TTPs. In this case, we're going to look at OS credential dumping. And we see two here. We have kind of that high level OS credential dumping technique, right? Mimikatz or something like that. Or we can actually dive a little bit deeper into just the Mimikatz. So for example, we're just going to go ahead and, hey, let's look at this, that OS credential dumping. This is our technique. I do a quick search inside that atomicredteam.io site, and this is what I find. I find atomic test number 10 is PowerShell Mimikatz. All right, this is going to basically use the exact Mimikatz tool set, and we're going to see if it's going to work. So as a quick note, when you're building these, there's kind of two ways to actually do this. There's one I call wide open testing, where you basically disable all security controls. And this is the best for leaving a lot of evidence on a system because Defender is off. It's not going to do anything. Or you can run it with Windows Defender or whatever your EDR tool is to see if it's going to validate any of those detections. Because one of the mistakes that's often made when you just start out with Atomic Red Team is you forget to disable Windows Defender and it eats your entire catalog of tests because a lot of it is technically malware. So here we go, and I start extracting these. This is the actual syntax inside the PowerShell script. Invoke atomic test, T1003.001, test numbers 10. And I always like to put get prereqs. A lot of them have prerequisites, some don't. But this is a good way to check. And then, so what this part of the script does is it goes out, checks, hey, are we all set to run this test? Yes, we are. Go ahead and run this test. That's all you have to do to start this process. What ends up happening is as you start working your way down, this is what it looks like inside the PowerShell script. It's a PowerShell script, so there's other aspects that you can do. You can set a time lag. If you don't want this all to execute in sequence with 1 or 2 seconds between tests, you can add, I want the first test, disable or modify tools to run, and then I want about 90 minutes to when the remote access software gets loaded. You can do that. You can just add that time, that time requirement within the PowerShell script, and it'll actually just do that for you. Or you could just say, I want these all to run at the same time because I'm validating our detection capabilities. All up to you. The beauty of using PowerShell is now you have the extensibility to use that tool set along with Atomic Red Team. So all we've done is taken a list of TTPs out of a threat intel report, put it into a PowerShell script. Let's go ahead and look at what this looks like from a testing perspective. So in this case, I'm running that test that we just discussed. And I go ahead and run it. Now, caveat, I'm running this test inside a box that has Windows Defender enabled. This is to give me a detection validation. So then I can pivot into my EDR tool where I'm just sending Windows Defender logs. It's basically our detection capability. And all I'm doing is to say, hey, am I logging this correctly? Is Windows Defender working? And can I see this specific attack? So here we are. We got some unwanted software and we're starting to work through. And there we are. Okay, so what I have now is that download from the PowerShell Mafia GitHub, and I validated that my detective controls can actually go out and see that. So all this is a combination of open source tools and Windows Defender. But as you can see, this is what we're looking at. So I may be building specific detections for this, or this is a good way to see if that detection control will actually work. Now, that's that single technique. But let's say if I want to look at the stage, and in this case, we're going to look at manipulating defenses. What you're going to see is I'm going to set up an emulation. I'm going to see if there's a detection or indicator, and then see where we move from this in terms of testing and response actions. So in this case, I'm going to use a manipulated defense PowerShell script that tests several different atomic red team tests in sequence to see what actually happens. So this is essentially running these tests, and very simply, I'm pulling out some of again, that threat intelligence, those TTPs, and this may take a second or two as it's working through this. Again, one of the other key benefits to using PowerShell is this often will actually log our activity. So you can save this as part of your testing. So here we see the actual discovery of a lot of different information. We start to see AV discovery via WMI, going through several tests there, disabling the Defender firewall via the registry, and then bang, we're done. So I execute that on the endpoint, and now I say to my responders, hey, I did something on this endpoint. You go ahead and pull the triage package with CAPE. They pull the triage package. They're going to start their analysis. Maybe they build out a timeline of activity using the prefetch file, for example. All right, they get the prefetch file using CAPE. They're going to go ahead, and this is that process. And this is where you're going to say, hey, it's going to take us an hour to get this down to getting practice, to down where maybe it's 10, 15 minutes. And this is that drill that we can use. So that's a very simple, cost-effective way to go about this, is to execute a emulation script and then actually execute on an endpoint and then see what you get. Think beyond that single technique. Really focus on really driving some of these multi-technique either threats, maybe the top 10 threats that just hit in the top 10 techniques that just hit in the last year, or something like that. More sophistication, getting that visibility, validation, and training repetitions. So at this point, are there any questions?